Welcome to MSP 1337. I'm your host, Chris Johnson, a show dedicated to cybersecurity challenges, solutions, a journey together, not alone. Hey, everybody, we're back again on Control 15. We are cruising through the CIS top 18, and we have finally made it to the last few controls. We are on Control 15 today, Service Provider Management. This is probably a control that I would argue every MSP is doing, whether involuntarily doing in some way, shape, or form. So the overview of this is to develop a process that evaluates service providers who hold sensitive data or are responsible for your MSP or your client's critical IT platforms or processes to ensure they are protecting the platforms and data appropriately. I know it's kind of a mouthful, but there's essentially two things happening here. One is data that you feasibly are storing with them. This might be like an IT glue where you keep things like configs for endpoints or network switches, that kind of thing. Or it could be data that is being accessed as a result of using their products or services. So like your RMM tool, or I guess any number of things that would fall into that category. So I guess we've got several MSPs with us today. We've got Anchor Networks, we've got Wolf Consulting, and we've got Reliable Technology Services. Guys, this is not foreign to you. How are you guys approaching, before we get into the controls, is this something that you've been doing prior to coming into CIS, or is it just a holy crap, we should be doing this?
Start out. We had been doing it ad hoc before the controls came along, right? Every time we took on a new vendor, we tried to do some kind of vetting. Internal leadership team would meet and talk about what their capabilities were, what they claimed. Now with our attempting to adhere and align to the CIS controls, we're trying to formalize that with a vendor checklist.
Gotcha.
Similar to what other people are doing.
So
yeah, for us, I would say.
Go ahead, Mike.
For us, I would say same thing as before we really started going down this journey. It was a lot of kind of just what's a cool tool for us to do, and let's do it, and not really any thought beyond the cost and commitment that we have with that. Now we're doing a checklist as well, and making sure we're asking the right questions that's related to security within the organization and more detailed.
Yeah, what about Lenny or Michael?
Pretty much the same thing.
Yeah.
Anytime we needed something, we would do our best to vet it out. It was nowhere near as comprehensive that it should have been. This control definitely opened our eyes to a lot of other stuff.
Yeah, I remember when I had my MSP, one of the things that we would say is if it doesn't integrate with our PSA, then it is not a product or tool that I need. And I remember some of the vetting processes that were kind of almost comical, because a vendor would be like, oh yeah, we full integration. That's called an email that goes into it's sending an email into my PSA. That's not integration. That's just sending an email. I can do that. I could be great. You could hire me. I'll create integrations all day long. If all I have to do is send an email to an inbox. But then you look at where we're at with these controls, and it's interesting because the first one and the only one in IG1 is to establish and maintain an inventory of service providers. And I've seen some of the dialogue happening in the Teams channels with the integrator groups talking about different ways to what information do you gather in this inventory process. And what I kept thinking about is when we were doing controls 1 and 2, we actually covered this, right? Like it does talk about operating systems and software, and the reality is cloud services are included in that stack, or third-party service providers. And so it's interesting that now we're on control 15, like you've seen with some of the other controls. We're kind of repeating it and getting laser focused on just those that are third-party service providers, which gets into it's more about the organization than it is the product, right? Like, so if you were managing the product yourself from a third party, this would be less important of a control, because that you already covered that in control 2. This is getting very specific around who are your third-party service providers. So, keeping it simple, it's like, hey, Do you have an inventory, review and update annually, or when significant organizational changes occur that could impact the safeguard? So that's an interesting one. Maybe we should talk about a little bit. Having inventory, you do this annually. How often do you check today that your organizational alignment still aligns with or doesn't conflict with the service providers that you're using?
We recently made a change, and I mean the how on this one is we're using IT Glue to track and store all of our vendors, make it easy for our staff to be able to look for tools and vendors that we use, and then the amount of detail that goes into it. So rather than going on the simple side of it, we're providing all this information, even down to the contract level, and that's where we started identifying of 90 days before the contract comes up for renewal. That's when we should be evaluating, looking at the product, looking at the changes that it may have had, or if it does still align with the organization, if there's overlap, and if they're still in the realm that we need them to be.
Right. And there are exceptions, right, that might trigger you to need to do something earlier than that. You know, suddenly a company gets acquired and you need to sort of be on top of it. But the reality is, for the most part, throughout the year, and Charles Love with Showtech used to say this to me all the time. He's like, Chris, we're not evaluating any more tools until this date. So he's like, if you are interested in a product or a service, he's like, put it on the list. And he's like, and then we can evaluate at this point in time. Otherwise, it was a hard no. And obviously, there's a lot of reasons for that, right? Being distracted from the job we're supposed to be doing to evaluate tools it kind of takes the desire to check out shiny objects, or suffering from shiny object syndrome, loses the shine if you have to follow a structure of only doing it during a certain window. The other controls that are in here that are IG2, IG3 is essentially the rest of the controls. We just covered IG1. That was it, is your inventory and sort of staying on top of your service providers. Because again, your third-party service providers are probably the most attractive for bad things happening and data being encrypted than you yourself are, but you have data in most cases that's living in their environments. So you said IT Glue. I'd also ask the question, like, what's the backup to IT Glue? Because, well, we know they're not infallible from something bad happening. So, like, and I know I've heard, what's that?
Export function that they have.
Yeah. And I know, like, Michael, we've talked about this before, like passwords, right? Password managers. Like, is there a vault somewhere that's maybe offline? And we joke about it. The Ellen DeGeneres, the password minder for the password, the master password minder for your password minder. And then they had like the little lockbox that you could put it in that was like a Hello Kitty journal case. But it's not so funny anymore after we've seen all the things happen with LastPass and others. So, what is your resilience, your business continuity plan that may need to incorporate some of those things as you look at third-party service providers? Yesterday, I was on a call with a MSP who was having problems with their VoIP service provider. They're a 3CX customer and have it all dialed in. It's all patched. They switched service providers to solve the problem, and now the problem is worse than it was before. And everybody's pointing fingers at the 3CX product and not really recognizing that the problem that they're having is absolutely 100% tied to the VoIP service provider, who can't seem to get packet control in check so that packets show up where they're supposed to in sequence. So again, like, what's their backup plan, right? They now need a new service provider, which goes hand in hand with this control. So let's go through the other safeguards. We don't need to spend a lot of time on them, because this is really what I think when we established this first safeguard, these really just reinforce or give you the means to do them well. So 15.2 is establish and maintain a service provider management policy. So obviously we were talking about it. Mike, you brought up like making changes to and the way you go about evaluating on an annual basis. That is, quite honestly, the policy, right? That should be what that policy really means. Number 3 is classify service providers. I know the stuff that was circulating in the integrators group was showing things like, what's the impact to business based on if they were to be gone tomorrow, or, what do they have access to? What types of data do those vendors store? So that as you're doing your annual review, you might go, wait a second, they just went public, or they now have a new feature in the product that does a whole lot more. Do we want to take advantage of that, or does it put us more at risk with regards to the data that they would now be consuming on our behalf? And
so
then
for that one,
yeah,
what are examples of what that would look like? I think that's where I've gotten hung up on this control before. I'm sure others would too. Is like, I mean, we know with data classification in the other controls, it's confidential, high, sensitive, public.
right.
How would you control? What are the classifications here?
So that would be it. And so you might think about things like, it might not just be your data. So it could be client data. And so that automatically probably would put you in a thought process of that is sensitive, no matter how else, or at least critical. And I think it's kind of like, it only needs to meet one or more of those characteristics before you start going, what am I comfortable with? So like, maybe it's your backup provider, and you've noticed that your volume of backup continues to grow and grow and grow. And obviously, as that data consumption continues to grow, the volume of data being stored with that vendor, you're continuing to put variables into the equation, right? Like, if I were to switch, how hard would that be? How much of that data do I need to move if I were to leave that vendor? And obviously, the longer the time you spend with a vendor, the harder it would be in that case to make that transition to another service provider. Other reasons would be regulations might come into play. So like, for example, I'll just use Datto as an example, because I know that they don't inherently meet FIPS requirements, good, bad, or otherwise. So if suddenly you're working with a client that goes, oh, by the way, we are now doing lots of CUI projects with Department of Defense or whatever, and we need to do something different. Well, you suddenly can't continue using, say, Datto's backup solution. You now need to look at a different solution that meets FIPS requirements for that client. That'd be the simplest example I could give for that one. Or what's the compensating control, right? Like, how do I make this work with that vendor and keep myself from having to either switch vendors in this one case or switch vendors collectively? I mean, there's ways around it, right? You could use a Datto appliance that sits one in your office and one in their office, and suddenly you've circumvented the FIPS factor because you're not putting it into a data center that needs to be FIPS compliant. So that kind of takes us right into 15.4. Ensure service provider contracts include security requirements. So this is a tough one, because you're kind of being put in the position of you're responsible for that due diligence, like at least understanding to what degree they are tracking this, right? So from a security standpoint, you want to know what they, backups, encryption, maybe the process in which you engage with the vendor in order to have something done. So like, for example, GoDaddy, you can't just call up GoDaddy and get tech support. You have to provide them with that PIN code or the secret. Those are things that are important, and vendors that don't have those security measures in place, you may pause for a minute and go, should we continue using that vendor? Or is the data that they have access to, or the data that we store with them, really not of a sensitive nature, and it's not a big deal if someone were to get access to that or make changes to that on our behalf without us knowing about it? And then that gets into assessing service providers, which gets into understanding and knowing about the things like PCI or SOC 2. Reassure service providers annually that you've got those when you renew the contracts. Do they have those papers in place so that you can ask, say, hey, I want to see the SOC 2 report. I want to see, which if you're under contract with them, those should be relatively easy to get your hands on. Not in all cases, but most vendors are not trying to hide from an existing client. If you're prospecting a vendor, they may not want to show you anything without getting an NDA in place. And I have mixed feelings on that. But at the end of the day, if your intent and their intent is sound, the NDA is really not a big deal. What they're really just trying to do is keep you from, if you find something bad in what you uncover, that you're not going to go broadcast it to the world, you at least give them a chance to fix it. And then 15.7 is to securely decommission service providers. Can anybody think of a reason why that might be a big deal? Or what decommissioning even means with regards to a vendor?
Yeah, we've seen this one before.
Yeah, you forget it. You forget to remove your API after you stopped working with vendor, and they still have access into your infrastructure.
Yeah. Or it's kind of interesting when you think about GDPR and how it was kind of, when it first came out, I was like, oh my word, seriously, like I'm filling out a form on a website. You want me to call them up and say, hey, now that you've got my information, I want you to remove it. Well, I think about it in the lens of like what we saw with T-Mobile and the breach that they had. That was data for people that applied for, but were not actually customers of T-Mobile. And so it's like, if you think about that in the context of vendors that you're working with, when you're no longer working with them, what data do they still have of yours that you should ask of them to remove, right? And that's the one that kind of has me kind of spinning a little bit. I don't know that there's a lot of really solid processes out there today to ensure that that happens, because obviously companies build products to do things like store data. They don't often focus on what happens if my client decides to leave. How do I get rid of all that data? Or similarly with your own clients, when a client leaves you, how good of a job do we do of removing their data from our own environment to reduce that liability? And I think that kind of goes hand in hand, because in this case, if your clients were filling out this control, you would be their vendor. So what does that look like? And maybe walk through that exercise, because then you can turn it on its head and use that with the vendors you have.
I can tell you, like, that's been one of the worst ones we've done. Is like we sign up for dozens of trials, we inject it with our data, and then we walk away from the trial. You know, I may still be able to log into those portals and see what was set up 2 years ago.
I know definitively you
on the
can.
vendor. Yeah.
Just check Meraki out. I just logged into a Meraki account that I forgot I even had. Logged right in. Granted, it was just dummy data, but
yeah, and that'd be that. I mean, that's easy enough too, to make sure that it's in the .2, the management policy is yeah, it's offboarding just like you would offboard anything else.
Yep.
It's going through the documents. How did we have this integrated? How do we reverse the integration? That's something that I think is MSPs easily overlook and not pull that out. I mean, go through your Autotask account now and see how many API integrations you have that you don't use anymore.
Yeah, so I'm going to throw this out there and we can wrap this up. There's a tool resource in here that is specifically for, say, your clients to ask about their MSP. So it's a guideline questionnaire to ensure that the enterprise's essential cyber hygiene needs are met by their MSP. So I've read through it a few times. I'll make sure it's included in the documentation that gets uploaded into Cyberhoot. I have found it to be a really interesting questionnaire, because it's not just MSPs that I should be asking these questions to. A lot of them are questions that you would probably ask any vendor that's going to provide services where data is involved, especially sensitive data. So guys, with that, we just went through very quickly Control 15, service management, or service provider management. Any questions before we end this, or any thoughts before we stop the recording?
We went through it pretty quick, but the reality is that this is one of the most time-consuming ones that exist here. Going through every single vendor that you use as an organization and documenting all that is very time-consuming.
Go back to controls 1 and 2, right? Because controls 1 and 2 should give you a pretty good picture of whose products and services you're consuming, so that when you get to this one, you should be able to go, hey, at least I know or have a good idea of what my inventory looks like.
This is one of those controls that it's not a product or a service that you can sell to your customers.
No.
So a lot of MSPs are either going to ignore it or move on from it, which is a big, big mistake. But every single time we talk about a control, I hear MSPs go out and say, this is how I'm going to do this for my customers, right?
Sure.
This is one thing that they're not going to ask themselves. How is my customer going to ask me those questions? And that's what kept me up at night when we started looking through all the CIS controls.
Sure.
When we got to the managed services and the vendor management, that means that if I'm going to be doing my job and I'm going to be educating my customers on all controls, this is one of them. And I'm putting myself in that bucket.
Right.
So now I better answer all those questions that I expect them to ask me, or what I would expect to ask of my vendors. That means keep your house in order first.
Sure. I mean, to some degree, it is a big deal, right? Because yes, you're not necessarily going to sell this, but there's a problem with a lot of the things that we do if we don't do this one. Good luck filling out an insurance questionnaire if you can't articulate well things like, is my RMM tool on-prem or in the cloud? Now that sounds like a random question, but like that's tied directly to some of those vendors that had real big problems, not to name any names. But if they're asking questions like that, we should make sure that we have done the due diligence on those vendors to say, yeah, we still use that vendor. Here's why. Because you're going to get questions that you have to be prepared to answer, and you don't want to have to go hunt for the answers in the heat of the moment, because usually the answers we get in the heat of the moment are not the answers we want to share with somebody else. All right, well, that is 15. I will put that stuff up. Michael, you had your hand up, so go ahead.
Just a quick comment. Since we are a community and we help each other out and we use same vendors across the board for the most part, we could rely on each other for some of the heavy lift of the some of the due diligence tasks, because they are absolutely identical for all of us. So that's something that secure outcomes groups can work together to speed up things and help each other.
I will make it a point with the work that I'm doing with some of the PAX8 resources and internally at CompTIA to start sort of creating that document. It's been long overdue. In fact, I have on my roadmap to create the vendor trust mark. That'll be coming in 2024. We're actually starting sort of outlining what that'll look like here now. I think that if we can get vendors to answer somewhere between 10 and 15 questions that's tied directly to this control, I think we will be well on our way to go, hey, I don't even have to ask the vendor questions. If they have the trust mark, I know they're doing what we said that we need them to do because they've done the due diligence and they've been vetted by a third party. So that's the goal. Thanks, guys. Have a great weekend, everybody. And, well, next week we will do Control 16.